On my far right, Dr. Bruce Greenwald is here. He's the Robert Heilbrunn Professor of Finance and Asset Management at Columbia Business School. In the middle, between the two of us, is the Honorable Lord Robert Skidelsky. He's an Emeritus Professor of Political Economy at the University of Warwick. He's also, maybe most notably, author of an acclaimed 3-volume biography of the late economist John Maynard Keynes. So let's give our two panelists a big round of applause, if you would. Thank you. I have lots of questions to launch our conversation, but maybe about halfway through, I'll ask you if you have questions. So by all means, if you have questions, there'll be a time for you to ask them as we move through our hour program here tonight. But I wanted to begin this evening with the same question that the Queen asked back in 2008 when she was at the dedication of a new building at the London School of Economics. And she asked almost this bluntly, why didn't more economists see the global economic crisis coming? How did we miss it? Dr. Greenwald, why don't you begin with that? How did we miss it?
Okay, I'm going to do a little advertisement here. Is this
pull that thing up closer to you there.
Can you hear me? Yeah, now I assume you can. So let me do a little ad for an economist who is not here first, and then I'll talk about why the other economists didn't do as well. I teach a course on globalization with a very distinguished Nobel Prize winner called Joseph Stiglitz. For various structural reasons in that course, we decided that there was a train wreck about to happen in the global economy. In 2002, the first time we told the course, he said there's going to be a recession next year. In 2003, he said there's going to be a crisis next year. In 2004, he said there's going to be a crisis next year. 5, 6, 7, he said there's going to be a crisis next year. 2008, he finally got it. And thank God for him, he was still willing to say that there's going to be a crisis next year. The thing that I'm trying to bring out here is that you can see structural issues that are going to cause trouble very often fairly far in advance. But economies, modern economies especially, with fairly large interventionist government sectors, are pretty robust. And if you look at any given year, crises are surprisingly rare. So getting the timing right as well as getting the occurrence right is much harder than you would think, and that is just an institutional problem in economics. Having said that, that position was very much a minority position in the profession, because like every other profession, military and otherwise, economists learned from the last war. And what we had had going into this crisis, especially in the United States, is a period of 17 years of absolutely unprecedented stability and economic growth. And I take this to be something that I hope people take away from this discussion. The economics profession is centered in the United States, and it is incredibly parochial. And Britain, by the way, also did well over those years. And the other country where there's a heavy presence in the economics profession is Britain. There were disasters in East Asia that people were prepared to overlook. Argentina, Mexico in the late 90s, Russia, and Brazil have serious crises. Nobody registered them because they didn't appear in the United States. So what you're seeing is everybody explaining the previous 15 to 20 years of very regular history. And because they were busy not seeing anything going on, they decided that old-fashioned free market economics was, in the face of all the evidence to the contrary, just in the structure of governments around the world, worked just fine. And I think that's really why most of them were asleep at the switch. So it's very hard to get the timing, and it's very hard in the face of that kind of experience and a central ideology, which is really that markets work really well, to get ready to go against that very suddenly.
Well, let me have Robert Skidelsky weigh in here, but then the question on the table is going to become, gentlemen, very quickly, I understand the difficulty in forecasting, the timing question. But what's the point of a rigorous academic study of economics if you can't even get the crash of 2008 right? Let me have.
Go ahead.
Robert, weigh in here.
I think you only got one very small word wrong in the Queen's question. She didn't say why did most economists not predict it. She said why didn't economists predict it. And I think that's reasonable enough. I mean, where you really, when you're talking about a profession, you're talking about the dominant tendency in the profession and not the outriders. And hugely distinguished, though Joe Stiglitz is, he wasn't part of the dominant, by no means part of the dominant Chicago mainstream. In fact, I once talked to Joe on this very point, and he said, I'm a completely isolated figure in the United States. And this was, I mean, 8 or 9, 10 years ago. Now, he may be feeling paranoid about it, but I think it expressed somewhat of his frustration, not being able to get good graduate students being told not to go to him, and not having any great influence on the development of economics. Now, I think that the Queen's question did lead to a lot of soul-searching, and various groups of economists tried to reply. And I think the most heterodox group, if you like, said, well, the fault lies in the way economics is done, and particularly in its reliance on abstraction, modeling based on unrealistic assumptions, overuse of mathematics when it's in inappropriate conditions, a model of the economy, DSG, that left out really banking and finance as being the standard model taught in most universities, and of course, above all, a belief that a reversion to the classical belief that provided one or two things, central controls, are got right, and particularly monetary policy and in this case, the inflation target, the economies were going to be cyclically fairly stable, and that huge instability was sort of ruled out almost by assumption. Efficient market hypothesis in the financial sector, it was one application of that. The Great Moderation, of course, reinforced it, but I don't think it was that great, and a lot of it was not very moderate. We also had a Great Moderation in the 1920s, and I think there was a very similar mindset, actually. By the end of the 1920s, before the crash, most people were saying capitalism has entered a new phase of perpetual prosperity. And the monetary authority, the Fed, has mastered the problem of maintaining price stability through open market operations, essentially, so that condition of prosperity, the absence of uncertainty about the price level, which was then regarded as the main generator of volatility, had been cracked. And therefore you could simply expect things to go from strength to strength. And there was something of the same mood. We forget, actually, that unemployment was quite a bit higher in the Great Moderation than it had been in the Keynesian era. In fact, in Britain, it was considered to be a great success when the government finally got unemployment down to 5% right before the crash. It had been 6-7%, and I don't think that is a satisfactory measure of full capacity utilization. It also, the Great Moderation relied, and here I entirely agree with what you're saying, it relied on a very skewed development towards the asset and real estate sector, and associated with that, a worsening distribution of income. So these were signs of weaknesses, but they were excluded, I think, from the way economics was taught to most students. Let me just say one thing about that. Economists often say, well, look, if you believe that this is what economics was saying, purveying. You are simply repeating a vulgarized version of orthodoxy, which no economists, no good economists ever believe. They all understand that, you must make many, many qualifications to all these standard things. But I'm talking about what students are taught. Most students are not going to become economists, most students of economics, but they are going to go out into the real world, the world of business, the world of policy making, equipped with some economic notions. And those notions are going to be at a pretty basic level. And if the basic economics they're taught is as disassociated from the real world as it is, then they're going to, all the way through, the advice they're going to give and the reactions they're going to have are going to be out of sync with what's going wrong, and therefore out of sync with the possibility of forecasting a disaster.
Well, that's pretty sobering.
Well, maybe two.
Yeah. Bruce, how about my question about if the field writ large missed the crash of 2008, what's the point?
Okay, let me just speak to this issue of, is it just the field writ large that got this wrong? Because there is, by the way, I mean, what Robert is talking about is a fairly narrow slice of the economics profession that teaches sort of introductory courses, which my experience of having gotten undergraduate students who I taught at Wesleyan back at Harvard Business School has an intellectual half-life of about 15 minutes. So I think it's pretty hard to blame those attitudes on what they get taught in Economics 101. But there is a world of people who are, you can think of, practicing economists in financial markets and other places. And what I think people have forgotten about late 2007, which is right before this happened, is that every signal in financial markets was there is no risk out there. And it's across the board. It's not just in mortgage markets that people think there are no risks. My favorite, because it happened to make a lot of money for members of my family, is that a credit default swap is basically an insurance policy against the default of a debt issue. Sovereign credit default swaps, that's insurance policies on governments defaulting, were such in 2007 that, to do the most extreme example, you could insure against a default of Dubai sovereign debt for 0.04% of the face value of that debt per year. That meant people were betting that Dubai, in the most volatile region on earth, dependent on the most volatile commodity out there, which is oil, was going to default once in every 2,500 years. Croatia was trading at 9 basis points. Italy was trading at 7 or 8 basis points. Nobody thought there was any risk in that. The measured volatility of the stock market is somewhere around 20 to 22% a year. But you can, again, buy options that insure against the volatility of the stock market. And the implied volatility of those options just before the crash was under 10%, which was a historical low. That credit default swaps on corporate debt were predicting historical lows on default rates on corporate debt that nobody had ever seen before.
Well, then how could so many people have been so wrong?
Well, that's the question.
That's my question.
What I'm trying to deflect the question to is, it wasn't just the academic economics profession that was so wrong.
But it wasn't.
Grab that microphone right there.
It wasn't just the academic profession. Of course it was, and no one would claim it was. But when you have insanity on such a large scale, you have to ask what the cause of it is. And people assumed something about risk. People assumed that risk could be measured in a way that it couldn't be. That was just false precision. They also completely ignored the potentially destructive properties of derivatives and the growth of the derivative market. Why did they do that? Now, I'm arguing that a lot of these people, all right, they don't learn about the efficient market hypothesis in their first lecture, but underlying the economics people are taught was an exclusion of uncertainty, a belief that all risk was the future was probabilistic and properly measurable, a belief that the more financial innovation you had, the more complete markets would become, financial markets, and therefore that some of the assumptions of general equilibrium in financial markets would be realized. Now, all that does derive from the economics they were taught. It has to, otherwise you're left with a hole. What you've described is perfectly accurate, but you have not described its cause.
Well, gentlemen, I have less confidence in economics right now than I did 15 minutes ago. Help me here. I mean, restore my faith here, or we can say goodnight and thank you very much for coming.
Okay, I think I'm going to endorse that statement, because I think the one thing that when you say, how did they get it wrong, that it is a very large it. And I don't think, by the way, that getting it wrong in forecasting the crisis was where the problem was. I mean, not understanding risk. They could have overestimated risk, but before the crisis, everybody decided to underestimate. And that is a human, not an economic tendency.
Meaning everybody was walking in lockstep.
Everybody was walking in lockstep, and everybody was walking in lockstep as if they knew what was going to happen. But let's really talk about the it, which is not the onset of the crisis. But if you look at the forecasts of the Federal Reserve, which is really an important economic institution, that's an academic institution, and the other central banks almost around the world, and I think the Economic Policy Committee, they have been consistently over-optimistic since then. That they have consistently, and you read it in the papers, green sprouts, recovery is coming, momentum is building. Europe was just about this year to get out of the long-term sort of stagnation that it had seen since the crisis. And that, I think, is where people have been most seriously wrong. You know, and I think that's attributable, because I'm now going to talk about causes, to really a quite different tendency that I'm sort of surprised affects economists, because I thought in some sense we were better Marxists than this. And that is, when something bad happens, people look to human explanations. There's got to be a bad guy here or a group of bad guys who did something wrong. And therefore, what everybody is focused on is the financial crisis. Just like in the Depression, people said, it was the stock market crash that caused the Depression. We know, I don't think there's any respectable economist anymore who thinks that the Depression is driven by the stock market crash. It's not a financial crisis initially. And I think the evidence is overwhelmingly there that this crisis is not a financial crisis. First of all, if you just look at...
It wasn't a financial crisis, so it was a what?
It was, I think, a structural underlying problem that, as I say, Joe Stiglitz identified starting in 2002. I mean, can I just give you a simple example of the dimensions of that? And it has to do with some of the things that Robert talked about. In the United States, to sustain full employment about 2005, we had to have a savings rate for households of close to zero. They've since revised it upwards, but it was essentially zero. What was going on is that the top 10% of households, who have about 50% of the income, save about 20% of their income. So those households were saving 10%. To get to a 0% overall savings rate, and this is 2005, in the United States, the bottom 90% of households have to be dissaving 10% of total income. They have 50% of income. That means they're spending 120% of their income every year. And I don't care what housing does, and I don't care what mortgages do. That is an unsustainable situation. And when that stopped, and that's what you saw, by the way, in the sort of economic crisis, is a huge increase in household savings. That ought not to have been a surprise to anybody. And the question you want to ask...
But why was it a surprise?
Well, I mean, I think people just weren't focusing on that. The question I think you want to ask, and this is where the cause comes from, is why was it that in the United States you needed that kind of household spending to sustain full employment? And I think the answer to that is also clear. That there were, at that time, nations, Japan for various reasons, Germany, China, obviously, Indonesia, Thailand, and Korea, who were committed to supporting their economies based on exports. And China is a big destabilizing force in that. The problem is that when you add up overall countries in the world, the imports and the exports have to be zero. So if they're exporting, somebody's got to import. It was originally, by the way, in the late 90s, the deficits were being run by Korea, Indonesia, Thailand. Their economies crashed because they had to borrow in foreign currencies, and the continuing deficits undermined the confidence in the currencies. They went from deficit to strong surplus. Somebody's still got to eat those surpluses. Ultimately, after they'd run through and destroyed Russia, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, they resided in the United States. So 6 to 7% of GDP income produced is leaking overseas in that deficit. And we are the consumers of last resort, and we just can't keep doing it. Now, that is none of it a financial problem.
Robert, weigh in here.
Yeah, well...
Grab that mic there, yeah. I'm the host, so I get a mic. You don't.
I half agree with what you said. I mean, there was a big structural problem, which, again, economics didn't focus on, because, it's not really part of the mainstream curricula, and that is the problem of distribution. And that simply had gone out. I mean, one of the declining areas in the economic curriculum from the time I knew it way back was welfare economics. I mean, welfare economics means something quite rather different today than it did then, when it was concerned with issues of distribution, which were regarded as political issues rather than something that economics ought to be centrally concerned with. But nevertheless, the trigger was the collapse of the banking system, the insolvency of the banking system. And that is what drove the economy down. That was the trigger. I mean, it's the First World War problem, really. Was the First World War caused by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo, or were there deep structural issues driving Europe towards war? And of course, the answer is that there were both. There were both triggers, and these triggers were to some extent a reflection of the structural issues. But the real question is, why didn't anyone take precautions against it? I mean, and they didn't take precautions against it because their analysis of the world was something one of the speakers said earlier. Their model of the economy was not prepared for this kind of event. When Alan Greenspan said that the trouble was the underpricing of risk worldwide, I don't think, he left that unexplained. He then said our whole intellectual system had sort of disintegrated, but he didn't specify exactly what that intellectual system was. But one of its elements was that, like an insurance market, the risks were supposed to be uncorrelated, and people were not supposed to be locked into step. Banks weren't, because the model of economics doesn't allow for that. I mean, it's a model based on methodological individualism. People bring to the market their preferences and their own individual decisions, and the idea of herd behavior is just not part of the way economics is taught. Of course, there are elements, people do take account of it, naturally, because in the end, the real world can't be completely excluded from the way economics is done, but on the whole, it's not equipped. Its guns are not equipped to deal with these kinds of problems. And again, what you said, just one last thing, another Greenspan thing is that these shocks, they're once in a century kind of events. Well, they're not. Volatility is ever present because you don't have such command over the future that you can say with certainty that we have confidence of X, that this will only happen, you know, this number of times over a period of time. You just have not got the knowledge to make that kind of assessment.
Let me do this. Let me ask one more question, then I want to open it up to our good audience members here for their questions. But one question this panel is supposed to address, and that's the students themselves. And Robert, you've alluded to this a couple of times here, and what they're supposed to be taught. The Financial Times just this week reports that universities across 4 continents, including this one, are rolling out this revamped economics curriculum after students protested they weren't getting the right stuff, and that means problems befalling the global economy. So what do you think? I mean, how is the next generation of economists supposed to spot the next crisis, much less prevent it, if things like private sector debt aren't on the table and there's this question of what students are being taught? And Bruce, why don't you grab the microphone and go with that?
I mean, all right, I mean, I can tell you what I think they ought to be taught, that they're not. I suspect it's not going to be what they're taught. And it's not, I think as we sit here today, the analysis that people have of how to solve this crisis is completely misguided because it's focused on fixing the financial system that is like trying to revive Archduke Ferdinand. Once the war is out there, it's the structural factors that take over. But let's just talk about, I'll give you a list. For all the students here, these are things you should never forget. Markets are not efficient. Financial markets are not efficient in any conceivable sense. And if you recognize systematic patterns of inefficiency, which is what I spend my life teaching, you will not only maybe forecast the next recession, but you'll get very rich in the meantime. There are systematic, flawed human behaviors when it comes to operating in financial markets that we've probably inherited from our hunter-gatherer periods that you've got to learn are out there. So again, it's a behavioral aspect of humans operating within economies that you have to pay attention to. Second thing is that you've got to remember some history. One of the most remarkable things I think about the Great Moderation was at how it moderated economic memory out of existence, that people forgot what business cycles looked like. So all of a sudden, they, after the fact, rediscover balance sheet cycles when in the 50s, 60s, and in this audience by Timon Minsky in the 70s and early 80s, all cycles were balance sheet cycles. So that's the second thing I think you should do. I would not exaggerate the importance of financial markets. Now, financial markets are exciting, and people in financial markets make a lot of money that they don't deserve, and they're really exciting people and enjoyable people to despise, and that all has a really attractive, distortive effect on your view of the world. And I think that's what's going on now. I mean, you look at what economies have suffered. What economy do you think has suffered most in this crisis? Which are the 2 big drops and slowest recoveries? Japan and Finland. And they're 2 countries that had nothing like financial crises. They had other structural problems that we could talk about. In Europe, the financial crisis comes incredibly late in the game. It is a cause, not a source of what's going on. So I would focus on the behavior of operating firms, of households consuming, of things like the distribution of income, and I would shy away from something that I think has been intensified by this crisis, which is this focus on finance. The 4th thing is that you have to talk about institutions. You have to talk about institutional behavior, how firms behave, how households behave. And you have to talk about it in empirical detail. And I'll give you an example of a talk this afternoon, and this is a very, I think, advanced audience in terms of teaching people what is important about economics. That was completely off point. Everybody is worried about household debt levels and whether household debt levels are having a depressive effect on consumption these days. You can actually measure that. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports disposition of household income, and they break it down into expenditures and consumption and savings. The difference between expenditures and consumption, which runs only about 1.5% a year, is household interest payments, consumer interest payments, which is the burden on these debts other than the cost of housing, and transfers overseas. That number is not only tiny, but because interest rates have been falling, it has been falling dramatically. You have to understand that, because otherwise you're going to be worried about things like household debt burdens, as a very intelligent economist here was. So you've got to look at the empirical dimensions of institutions in a way that we don't teach them to look at it, including households, including banks, and including firms. Now, when you look at firms, I think one of the things that we teach people, and will continue to teach people, is that interest rates matter. There is enormous discussion of interest rates. They do matter for the distribution of income, but nobody has ever been able to detect an interest rate effect on demand for investment or household savings. That risk perceptions dominate among institutions their concerns in making investment decisions. And you have to teach people that and forget about the R variable that you have in your models, and I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen. What that means in turn is that when you talk about monetary policy, you cannot talk about it in the abstract. Monetary institutions matter a lot. The institutional form of banking systems matter a tremendous amount. I think it's fair to say that across the world, whether it's Abenomics, the European Central Bank, or the US Fed, there is no significant evidence that they've had a positive effect. In fact, how they defend themselves is they, oh, if we hadn't done this, we would have had a depression. But again, you can look at countries that didn't do it, and they didn't have depressions. Successful monetary interventions with the institutions we now have in place do not look like traditional monetary policy. They look like what the Swedes did in the middle 1990s when they had a tremendous problem that they solved, what the Koreans did in the wake of the Asia crisis, which is direct recapitalization of the banks. So I think it is that emphasis on understanding markets are imperfect, understanding the nature of history, understanding the structure of institutions, and looking at the empirical regularities that are staring us in the face of things like the effect of the distribution of income on U.S. household savings. Sorry, that's a long answer.
Robert, grab that mic.
Well, yeah. Well, most of them left out of mainstream curricula as they're presented to students. I think they're that's all very sound. I mean, I think you'd be a great teacher of a revised economics curriculum. Maybe that already exists in your department. But one thing I think arising from your emphasis on empirical work is I think economics has always really been a deductive science. And its assumptions have simply often been plucked out of the air. I mean, if you take something like the origins of money, which Randall was talking about this afternoon, I mean, no one have actually looked at any evidence as to how money might have started in older civilizations. They just assume that the rational person would realize the inconvenience of barter and therefore devise some medium of exchange. I mean, and that's how it worked in Adam Smith. And from that, you simply lost a great deal of historical knowledge. You just weren't interested in excavating it as to how money had actually started and its role in its token money and its role in creditor-debtor relationships. All that sort of just was not there. And I'd say you've got to alter the deductive bias of economics, but that's incredibly hard because it's embedded in the discipline and the way it's been done from earliest times. I think the other thing I'd say is you should not exclude any discipline at all from the study of human behavior in the economy. And that doesn't just mean economic history and the history of economic thought, very valuable though it is to know about those, but you've got to have anthropology, you've got to have sociology, and you've got to have political theory and science as part of the training of an economist, because what you're trying to do all the time is to explain economic behavior, and economics is a very, very limited tool for explaining economic behavior, partly because of its deductive element, partly because its assumption of its behavioral assumption, which is that of rationality, which is one that you can't say, look, all economists have known that these aren't quite true, but I think people will be taught that approach and that view of human behavior. I mean, behavioral economics is now making some strides, and I have some sympathy with it, but it doesn't abandon methodological individualism.
Okay, your questions. Who's got a question? Yes, ma'am. You were first up. Okay, the question on the table is, are we reacting, should our response be more moderate? Should we accept the trend that we're headed in right now?
It's like collateral damage. It's just part of capitalism. Is what's going to happen. Let's do the best to mitigate it, but you're never going to be able to eradicate it, because if you eradicate it, you're going to eliminate the ability of the capitalist system to, what I consider very effectively and efficiently, resolve problems of production and distribution.
Okay. Are we overreacting, gentlemen?
You want to speak
Yeah.
first? Let's give it to you.
Well, I don't think we're overreacting. I think these collapses, and they are serious wherever they occur. This has been the most serious one since the Second World War. They do cause enormous collateral damage, which is your phrase. They impose huge costs on large sections of the population. They also damage growth potential, and so the recoveries are not complete. We've never had a full recovery from a serious depression in peacetime. I mean, we're actually we did completely recover from the Great Depression, but only under the conditions of war between 1939 and 1945, and then the economy took up again. So the effects of serious depressions of this kind are very long-lasting. It's not that the patient bounces back to the rude health that he or she enjoyed before. There's a long lingering disease, and then lots of things can happen during that time in which they're more vulnerable to attack, to disease, which can slow the recovery and put it back into recession. So no, we shouldn't minimize the collateral damage, and we should take precautions against it. We should have a system which, two things. We should have a system which allows capitalism to do the things it does well, which is to innovate and encourage enterprise and avoid the dead hand of purely bureaucratic systems. I mean, that's an enormous advantage. But we should also use the state to think about, I would say, we should also think about life beyond capitalism. I mean, which is something I think that you didn't, your question assumed somehow that this is going to go on in this way with its ups and downs, and there's not much you can do about it. You can mitigate it, but I don't think this is a system that's going to last forever. I think it's time limited. So those would be my two on yes, don't accept the collateral damage, do think about the future.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you and disagree with my learned colleague. We have had lots of financial crises, most notably in the United States in 1991, which was a much more serious problem in the banking system than actually occurred this time, without a significant recession. Sweden has a terrible banking problem. Every bank is bankrupt in 1995, and because they correct it, it actually doesn't impair the economy for very long. People forget those. And what they remember is the Depression and this crisis, which has been very long-lived, and Japan, which has been brutally long-lived. And I think what they're doing is they're not thinking about causality. That the question is it the financial crisis that causes the big, long-lived problem, or is it an underlying structural problem in each of those cases? And I'm prepared to name it and explain why World War II worked so well, which is, by the way, the locus of the single worst forecast in the history of Keynesian economics. The Keynesian economists, Paul Samuelson and Hansen, were running around Washington in 1944-45 saying the suppression is coming back and you better get ready for it. And they were wrong, and I think they were wrong because there was a structural problem that got corrected by the war.
Because there was a Second World War.
But when the war went away, just like when the First World War went away, why did the economy not lapse back into the Depression?
Well, one of the reasons was there was a very, very high level of military spending. That, you know, the role of the government post 1945 was much greater than it had been before.
Well, okay, I have a different explanation, which I'm not going to give here. I gave someplace else. But I think that when you look at these financial crises that don't have effects, and then you look at the fact that if there's an underlying structural crisis, sooner or later, as it did in Europe, I mean, Europe, the banking crisis is very late. The global crisis occurs first, and it brings the banks down. It's clearly a cause, not an effect. There, that it's the underlying structural problems that are actually very difficult to fix, that we are nowhere near fixing in this crisis. And the banking and financial crises, like, for example, the tech crash, which nobody noticed, at least in terms of the real economy, are things that you may be able to live with. Now, that doesn't mean you don't want to worry about contamination from the financial system to the actual economy. But it does mean that this focus on just the financial system is probably exaggerated, and if it defers attention or diverts attention from these other underlying problems, of which the distribution of income is one, is going to be dysfunctional. So I'm more on your side on this one.
Somebody else. I saw some other hands up. Yes, sir. Front row.
There's an organization called FEMA, Professional Risk Managers International Association. These are the people in Wall Street that had all these risk management models. 4,000 members around the world, almost every bank. I am an honor, I was made an honorary member of FEMA. Why? In 2002, I wrote a book called Think About Money in the Real World. I specifically state, I don't have the pages,
You and Joe Stiglitz.
I took 50% of my retirement income out of stocks into other things, and that certainly feel good, but the stock market continues to rise. Okay, so the financial, look at 1929. Remember Irving Fisher?
Here's, a lot of folks can't hear you, so give me your question if you would.
The question is, do financial markets really hurt? In 1929, there was a real estate boom and a financial boom, and 2 weeks before the crash, Irving Fisher, who was a great economist at the time, said, "Don't worry, America, we're on a plateau, and the only way we can go is up." Okay?
And what's the question here?
The question is, financial markets are not something you sort of talk, well, there's institution and there's financial markets, but there's a tremendous interaction between financial markets and what people,
But I think that's the question we just spoke to.
and don't, this, and the great recessions are always started by a financial crisis.
That is not true in.
What you say.
Yeah, the Depression starts, the contraction starts in August of 1929. That is a well-established fact.
That's true, but
I can't have a whole audience here. I can't have a dialogue here between, grab them afterwards. How about somebody else with a question?
Could I just make a comment on that before, while other thoughts are gathering? I think that this is a question, a method of how you analyze things. You can have structural things that are structurally wrong going on for a long, long time. But what form the crisis takes is not predetermined. And what these kinds of structural imbalances you've been talking about, and I agree existed, I think they exist in America before 1929 as well, they tend to eventually have their explosion in the financial system. And now, if you then want to say, the financial system is a secondary phenomenon, and what you must pay attention to is the structural issue. That's a matter of preference, intellectual preference. But you've got to take both into account. And it's not a wrong instinct to try and fix the financial system and try and make sure that we avoid these things. But you also, of course, have to pay attention to structural imbalances. Which both domestic and also international. I agree with that, and we haven't done anything about it. And we haven't done anything about it because it's bloody hard to do anything about it at the moment. Politically, it's very, very hard to do anything about it. No one is really prepared to tackle head-on the question of income distribution, and no one is prepared to tackle head-on the question of global imbalances or imbalances in the European Union between Germany and the rest of the members of. So the banking system seems the easiest to fix, though it's not that easy because you're having huge resistance from the bankers to any effective attempts to fix it, like securing adequate capital adequacy ratios and effective stress tests and all the things they're talking about. So, I mean, what you've got is a blocked system. But I go back always to the point I'm interested in making, really, is that economics isn't giving it much help. And although economics is not a decisive factor in any argument, certainly not in any political argument, it would help if economics helped those reformist politicians who wanted to do something to do it.
I saw some more hands. Yes, in the green shirt right here in front. Yeah. The role of fraud. But the question has to do with the role of fraud in this most recent crisis, and Bruce, why don't you roll there?
You sure you want me to talk about this? Okay. I mean, first of all, let me start with your last sentence.
Put the microphone up closer.
Let me start with
Yeah.
your last sentence. The
Can you all
poor
hear okay up there on top?
Now, remember you talk about the poor sucker down the line? You know who the poor sucker down the line was in this crisis? It was massive financial institutions in Europe and other places. They're not who I normally think of as poor suckers down the line. So you've got to be, I think, pretty careful when you talk about fraud, which has connotations of direct misrepresentation of facts in individual transactions. And there's certainly some of that. I mean, you can't pretend that everybody was above board. And practices that everybody pretty much knows are close to the edge. And some of the people just don't recognize it. So I think it's very hard to distinguish. Now, I think that if you concentrate on eliminating the fraud, you're not going to do much harm. But I don't think you're going to fix the problem. And I'll give you an example of fraud, which is also, I think, by the way, what economists should teach, which is most fraud that's most damaging is called self-deception. There was a famous collapse of a hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management in 1998. And that was a financial crisis that, again, everybody thought was going to bring the system down and didn't. That it didn't carry over into. I happened to have sat next to, in August when the fund collapsed in September, to the principal intellectual star of this fund. And we were talking about how stable stock market and other financial performance was. And he said, and this is something that Robert brought up, he said, look, Bob Merton has taught everybody how to spread risk optimally, and all those random fluctuations in markets have just gone away, and they're going to get steadier and steadier. And I thought, here we are in the middle of the internet bubble, which is one of the biggest bubbles of all time, which it turned out to be, and you think markets are rational? And I think of that as the variety of damaging fraud that enabled AIG to sell us credit default swaps on Dubai sovereign debt at 4 basis points. I mean, those are not poor, stupid people. Those are people who deceive themselves. And that's why when I talk about economics properly taught, and I think the issue of fraud and self-deception is a critical part of that, I wouldn't stop at anthropology. I'd make people read literature, because all the great literature is actually, in some sense, about self-deception. And I think trying to punish that, you're going to get in real trouble.
How do you reconcile self-deception with rational expectations?
You're asking me? Do I sound like somebody who believes in rational expectations?
But practically all economics is taught on that assumption. Practically all of it. And that is exactly why, while I applaud most of the things you've said, you are a minority voice in this profession, and you're a marginal figure, and I'm an even more marginal figure, and the whole and post-Keynesians are marginal within the profession as well. Though of course they're among very few people who talk any sense. That's what I mean by a damaged profession. It has the history of how this damage came to be inflicted or re-inflicted after the 1980s is a very, very important and interesting question. But it lies at the root of a lot of the unexpectedness of the events of 2008 and 2009, and the failure to take intellectual precautions against something like that happening, because the theory was just looking the wrong way. And because the theory was looking the wrong way, the dissolution of the role of the government, the dismantling of the role of the government in the financial system and in attention to the distribution of income, both of those things were the result of essentially the Thatcher-Reagan revolutions and the intellectual atmosphere which accompanied them, or maybe even helped cause them. So you're always trying, I think, to protect the economics profession against some of these charges, although everything you say is against what the mainstream is teaching.
Let me be quite clear. When you blame the academic economics profession, which as far as I can see it, when you blame the academic economics profession, which as far as I can tell is completely divorced from mainstream reality, I think that that's, I mean, I wish we were that powerful. It just seems to me that it is not that powerful. What you're dealing with is a much broader collection of people who practice economics in real life. That's why I think your question about what are we going to do in introductory undergraduate economics is a really good question, because it is the people who come out of those courses with the hand of dead economists underlying their beliefs, which I've mangled a quote from Keynes over, that you want to be concerned about because they actually make the decisions in the markets. And I think that to think that they believe in rational expectations almost certainly means you haven't talked to any of them in a long time.
We've got time for one more. One more.
I wonder what we're disagreeing about at this point.
I don't think much.
Yes,
just
sir.
for the importance of financial crises.
Yes, right there. I'm having trouble hearing you. I just want to recommend that I teach a class here in Comm Studies. It's the art of the interview. And in that class, you learn how to ask questions very, very succinctly. And I love all of you, and that's a fine question. But the question has to do with what? Why haven't we applied? Can you repeat that, Bruce? I'm having trouble trying to summarize exactly.
Oh, okay.
I had trouble hearing.
There was a set of imbalances that everybody knew was out there. There were these chronic surplus countries, and by the time of really post-2003, there was a chronic deficit country, which was the United States. And people were sort of worried about that. But that looked like it was working out pretty well. And the reason I say that is that for the surplus countries, they really had no choice. I mean, they were selling us goods, and they were accepting dollars in exchange. And everybody said, oh, the Chinese are going to dump those dollars. The only way foreigners are going to get rid of those dollars is to run deficits on trade and current account with the United States. And to do that, if you're China, would destroy your manufacturing sector. So that wasn't going to happen. Wasn't going to happen in Germany. Wasn't going to happen in Japan. Wasn't going to happen in Korea, Thailand, and Indonesia. Wasn't going to happen in the oil economies. So that was perfectly stable. They were going to have to eat those dollars. They had no choice, and they were going to have to continue to do so to keep their domestic economies, and in particular, what they regarded as these important manufacturing sectors afloat. For the United States, hey, it was a party. You know, we just kept dishing out the paper and getting the cameras and the cell phones and so on. Now, the deflationary pressure associated with that was something that people seem to have overlooked. And I think that that's because, again, they thought economies adjust to things like that. There are price or exchange rate adjustments that will take place. And I think that was the sense of the IMF, that the U.S. was not on the edge. And what they then underestimated is if the U.S. was no longer the consumer of last resort, so our deficit went away, those surpluses were going to shrink, and there is going to be a whole lot of pain in those economies. I think it's because they didn't think through the consequences of the one central player whose situation was unstable.
Well, yes, just two quick comments. I agree with that. I mean, I think there was, before the crisis, it was a general view that the US would have no problem in financing its deficits. And I think that view stemmed from the traditional view that money is simply an intermediary. I mean, it's something that harmonizes, that intermediates between any imbalances that arise. And the second thing, I think, is this belief in price adjustment. That you know, the invisible hand would sort it out. It might take a long time. Meanwhile, there'd be no problem in financing it. But in the long run, I mean, you'd have price adjustment. And I think that still underlies the view of the view of many people about the crash, the consequence of the crash. They thought there would be a V-shaped incident, and that there'd be a rapid recovery because prices would adjust quickly to the new situation. And I think that biases in the way people are taught economics. I mean, when you're taught these supply and demand diagrams very early on in your life, they get stuck in your head and you assume some automatic adjustment process. And then you have to explain why it doesn't happen in that way, and that brings you into contact with the real world, and then you sort of have lots of ad hoc reasons for these deplorable, the failure of real things to work out according to the theory.
Well, Lord Robert Skidelsky and Bruce Greenwald, thank you very much. Give them a big round of applause.
By the way, our view of why World War II works is that what you've got in